Hi everybody, my name is Chris Deacy. I'm going to say a couple of things about Halloween. Now, I work in the Religious Studies department at the University of Kent. I teach courses on religion and film and death in the afterlife, and it's Halloween season. And I also go to the cinema rather a lot. You'll see the evidence of that in just a minute when I put the slides on. And we look in my courses at some of the things, the films that I've been watching of late, many of which have had a Halloween and horror theme, very much resonate. So I'm quite keen in the course of my teaching and research to unpack all of that. So I'm just going to say a little bit about three films that I happen to have seen within the last 7 days. The first one is actually a film that was made when I was, I would have been about 11 years old. And this is the first time I've seen it. And it's called A Nightmare on Elm Street. Why did it take me so long to see it? So A Nightmare on Elm Street was made in 1984. And it was a kind of, I would say, an effectively eerie, dream-based horror movie. And it has a far more resourceful and combative woman in peril heroine than you see, for example, in Halloween, the Jamie Lee Curtis. I was about to say trilogy, but there's rather more than that. There's 6 or 7 or more of them. Actually, the film that this is most like, I would say, is Psycho. I don't know if you know Psycho, Hitchcock's masterpiece going back to, 1960. And we're introduced to the heroine, who is then, within the first, 15 minutes of the film, brutally massacred. And of course, it wrong foots us, the audience, because we lose our center of gravity. And I think in Psycho, then, we've got the doppelganger who then appears after the gruesome death of Marion Crane to take up the story. And here you've got Tina Gray, who we think is the protagonist of the film, who is slaughtered quite early on, and then she reappears in a body bag in the school classroom. The film has all of these very sort of fiendishly frightening gore fests. Now, in Psycho, Marion Crane's murder may or may not be related to the punishment meted out to her for embezzling from her place of work. And in Nightmare on Elm Street, the assumption is that Tina is being punished for having sex with her underage, well, she's underage and her boyfriend is underage as well. They're from the same classroom. And it's the sort of conceit that Wes Craven, who made this film, also a decade later in the Scream trilogy, did very much the same kind of thing. You've got A Cherry Falls is another example, which is a bit of a parody of Wes Craven's films, where a psychopath kills all the girls in the high school who happen to be virgins. But what I think works really well in Nightmare on Elm Street is that we're never sure whether characters are awake or dreaming. And the film plays on all of these layers. It plies on all of these Jungian motifs about the collective unconscious. All the teens who live on Elm Street appear to be sharing a dream. It's of a disfigured child molester who has knives for hands. And I guess if this is with my theologian's hat on, I would ask whether this kind of works as maybe a twisted variant on original sin. It looks like the dead Freddy Krueger has been resurrected, at least in the unconscious, to inflict punishment on the children of the vigilante community that were responsible for his brutal killing. And the implication seems to be that sin and guilt has been passed down through their descendants, through progeny, like one of the characters in one of my favorite films, which is Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear. The villain, Fred Krueger, in the case of Nightmare on Elm Street, is both Redeemer and Avenging Angel. And what I liked about Nightmare was the line between waking reality and dream world is blurred. It kind of makes the ending a bit incongruous. It's a little bit over the top, not very probable, really. But I was actually thinking as I was watching the film that it would really fuel a good debate about the relationship between multiple realities. And as it so happens, on the day that I saw the film, well, I saw it in the evening, but earlier that day, I was teaching a course on death and the afterlife. And one of the things that we do in that module is look at the notion of mind-dependent worlds. And I thought that the film was really good at kickstarting this conversation about whether the afterlife might be akin to the world of our dreams. Do we go to a physical heaven or hell, or could it be a mental environment akin to the way in which, when we dream, we flip from one place to another? We can imagine ourselves being in different geographical places, but mentally we are in the same, we're not actually geographically moving. And I wonder if that kind of analogy, which Nightmare on Elm Street plays with ruthlessly, is possibly a good way to make sense of that film and engage with it theologically. Now, the second film I want to look at is a brand new film. It's a Netflix drama, which is also showing at the cinema, and it's called His House. And there's me watching it completely wrapped. And actually, I was the only person in the screening, which is, and I was wearing a mask, just to clarify, and I did take it off just so I could have a hot dog and a latte. But I thought this was a really gripping, very mature, very sophisticated horror film. It's quite unconventional, really, because its feet are solidly grounded in a very tangible, real world milieu. The principal characters are asylum seekers from Sudan, and we first see them at a detention centre somewhere in England. The couple are keen to make a fresh start in their new country, but they're assaulted on two fronts. On the outside, they struggle to be accepted. Local children are taunting them to go back to Africa, even though the children themselves are of BAME descent. And this is as much a film about cultural assimilation as it is about horror in and of itself. That's probably why it really works. A bit like, I don't know, Rosemary's Baby is a good example. It has a very grounded real world setting, and that makes it even more eerie, that you can imagine these characters as living. You can imagine them being in the neighborhood, the apartments or the houses next to you. And there's just something a bit creepy that you watch a film like Rosemary's Baby and you think, I know somebody just like that, and it sort of gets your mind thinking in all sorts of directions. But what I think works really well in His House is that it does give you the horror, the kind of standard horror tropes of demonic faces, and you've got in this film spindly hands that appear through the cracks in the walls of his house, and images of voodoo and witchcraft. But there's also a very credible storyline involving the lead couple's attempt to engage with, to try to mollify immigration and housing officials who are assessing them to see whether they, quote, fit in and are getting along. The accommodation that they're living in, His House, is dilapidated, yet they're not allowed to move elsewhere through fear of violating the conditions of their bail. But also on the inside, the couple are faced with images and sounds from the rival tribal groups that force them to leave their native Sudan in the first place. And as a couple, they're torn between the guilt they feel over fleeing their Sudanese roots and having lost a daughter to drowning on the boat that they traveled on to leave their homeland, and then wanting to make a new start in what turns out to be another hostile environment, but one in which they have no ancestral, no communal attachment. So it's kind of a difficult film to characterize. Really, there's nothing really with which to compare it. And the worst horror of the film is not so much the disfigured supernatural apparitions that populate their home and which seek to possess and consume them. It's the inhumane, the bureaucratic procedures and the personnel, which don't so much, well, actually they do as much to drive them into madness and despair as the ghostly apparitions of their departed daughter, which very much embody and undergird their fear, plays on their fear and grief, their guilt, that sense that they do not belong. So I thought it was a very unsettling lesson in cultural diversity. It also deals with genocide and the implications of it, and displacement. And I thought it was quite refreshing to watch a horror movie in the week of Halloween that engages with the rudiments and the rituals of African tribal religion in order to explain the things that go bump in the night. And the third film is a bit kind of nostalgic for me, I guess, because I saw the original The Craft in the middle of November. Actually, I had a sneak look at my diary. It was Friday the 15th of November, 1996. And actually, the characters in this film probably weren't even born back then. And it seems to be very much a season for showing a lot of older Halloween films. I mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street. I noticed that Hocus Pocus, made in 1993, is very much doing the rounds. That's showing in the multiplexes at the moment. But The Craft Legacy is a sequel. It's taken them 24 years to the 1996 original. I thought it actually did a couple of quite good things. Let me start with the negatives. I thought it was a bit disappointing because there was a remake actually, that I saw back in December called Black Christmas, which looked as though it was going to say something really serious about the Me Too movement by calling out inappropriate behavior on the part of male students in that film on a university campus by the female victims of sexual assault. But that film then showed us the same women being victimized and even killed by mask-wearing male students who, under the leadership and the direction of the English literature professor, perform an ancient ritual which invokes the name and spirit of the early 19th century misogynist founder of the college, the objective of which is to turn the tide away from female empowerment by reinstating female subservience and male domination. Now, in Black Christmas, any female students who resist will be punished and slaughtered, while only those female students who agree to be sex slaves are spared. Now, I was very disappointed with Black Christmas. It was a film that squandered the opportunity to say something meaningful about woke culture, racism, sexism, in order to fit the paradigm of a slasher movie. Now, The Craft Legacy is better than that, I wouldn't say by much. It also contains the revelation that one of the peace-loving and violence-hating male characters is on a mission to harness the supernatural power of witches in order to recalibrate the world so that men can return to their apparently rightful place at the center of the universe. Any men who wobble or deviate from this prototype, maybe because they're gay or overly sensitive, maybe because they even like to hang out with the girls in their high school, they must be killed so as to restore the balance of order. Now, it's pure hokum. I thought the film did work well. It worked better when it tried to settle for the more earthbound and relatable depiction of what it's like to grow up as someone who doesn't quite fit in. There's a protagonist who, with shades of Carrie from Brian De Palma's classic horror film from the 70s, on her first day in her new school, has a very bloody period in class, and she's relentlessly mocked for it afterwards. And the girl then falls in with a coven of witches in her class, and together they use their powers to effect a little naughtiness, and they reclaim girl power. That's very 90s, isn't it? In an otherwise misogynistic school environment. And there are consequences to the witchcraft, though, because the witches start to query whether intersectional feminine power is something to be celebrated or is it something to be resisted. Now, my sense is that it probably would have worked better as a TV series rather than a feature-length film. And I thought the very last scene had a nod to the original Craft movie that I saw 24 years ago, which perhaps suggested that it would have worked better if made as a series of episodes. I don't think you're going to have to wait 24 years, though, for the next installment. But why are all these horror films doing the rounds? What is it about the horror? What is it about the unknown and the uncanny that appeals to us? Are the people in the film suffering and dying? Are they victims so that we don't have to be? What is it about vicarious suffering that goes on in these films? These characters are playing the role very much in keeping with ancient world debates and rituals around, for example, Day of Atonement and the notion of someone suffering, an animal it could be, or a human, for the sins of another. These debates have been brought up to date in modern horror movies, and they're doing the rounds at the moment, and it's the week of Halloween. I'd strongly recommend them, but at the same time, I'd also say if you're going to go and see any of these films, just ask, what is it that we are being initiated into? Why are we watching these? What are we getting out of them? What is our predilection towards horror? And more widely, what do these films have to say about wider issues relating to the supernatural and to death, our fear of death, and the afterlife?